Welcome to our podcast, We're Not So Different.
I'm Samira.
And I'm Ali. We're two professionals having real conversations about our experiences at home, work, and out in the community.
We tell our stories through the lens of our different backgrounds to just find out that we're not so different.
In our podcast, we'll explore ways that we can improve engagement and bridge social gaps while trying to find the humor in it all.
Check us out on social media at WNS Different or email us at wnsdifferent@gmail.com.
This is the first episode of We're Not So Different. And this initial launch of our podcast is an idea that the two of us came up with just to have a creative outlet, an outlet of expression, free form to talk primarily about culture, getting around bias, getting around cultural misunderstandings, and trying to shed a little bit more light on the fact that despite being different, we're not so different. And this is a forum for us to do that. So today, our launch episode, we're going to talk about the provocative N-word. We're going to talk about language from a cultural perspective, both at home and at work, outside, inside social life, how we use language, how language impacts our lives even at home, what we say, what we can and can't say around our parents, what we can and can't say around adults, and even the generational difference between how you may have been allowed to speak at home when you were young versus how young folks today are allowed to speak at home.
We both work together at the same company, and the way all of this started was we were both very active in our employee resource groups at our company, and where we have a lot of conversations about diversity and inclusion and the challenges around having these types of conversations at work. And that's really how it started. And then we just had so much fun having the conversations that we thought it would be great to share it with you guys and see if maybe you can get some value from our different perspectives. So I am an American-born Iranian. I'm also Muslim. My children, I have two boys. They're 14 and 18, and they're mixed. So their father was African-American. And so I bring, my perspective of growing up in a small town in Fresno, moving to the Houston area for about 5 years, and then been in the Silicon Valley for about 10 years now. So I have a very different perspective coming from those different areas, and just the work that I've done throughout my life in the Muslim community, in the Iranian community, and just, existing and observing. And Ali?
Yeah, I'm a native of the Bay Area. I'm Black or African American, whichever term you choose to use.
Which I never know which one to use, so thanks for making that so much easier for the non-Black African American community.
And I also have one son. He's Black. His mother's Black. My parents are from the South, spent most of my life in the Bay Area. Both of them are Black, and I guess I'm stressing the Black so everybody knows I'm Black through and through. I can probably trace all the way Black technically to a plantation somewhere based on my last name.
Have you ever done that?
I haven't yet. I think the name, I know that my father's father's father was a slave for a fact, and my dad actually sharecropped for a short period of time because my father was born in 1933, so I'm an old.
What state?
Old dad, Arkansas. Originally, my mother's from Louisiana, so I know that my father, when he was very young, there were still places in the South where you sharecropped, where there would be.
What does that mean, sharecrop?
So sharecrop, for those that don't know. So after slavery, when they set everyone quote unquote free and left them with nothing, there was a twofold issue. One is all these Black folks have nowhere to go, and they own nothing, right? Because the South wouldn't give them anything. Okay. But then, kind of like ironically, in a weird way, like you run into situations today where, well, if your labor force disappears, who tends to your fields, right?
Right.
So, what they did to manipulate the system or as part of the system, not even manipulate the system, but the system as it existed then, what they came up with is, okay, fine, we can't own slaves, but we need you to do the work. So what we'll do is we'll say, here's a small parcel where you can live, but I'm your landlord. So you owe me rent. You have to pay me for food, even though you're the one tilling the fields, right? And growing food or whatever if it's cotton, tobacco, whatever the crop was. And so they called that sharecropping. So the name sounds nice, but the reality was basically you were essentially indentured servitude, right? So it was, I'm there with my family, I'm working the field for my former master, ironically, and I have to pay him for everything that I use. So I have to pay him for rent, pay him for water, pay him for food, even though I'm doing the work, and basically created a situation where I would owe him forever. So I really couldn't get out of that situation. So it was basically a form of indentured servitude. So my great aunt on my father's side worked on a farm and essentially had my dad at a young age sharecropping there.
Your dad was born in 1933.
Yeah.
So
this
let's say
was
well
in
into
his
the
40s,
40s, 50s. Like, he was still doing that. That is insane. 1865 is when
and even
it was announced in the South.
Right. And that's the thing, right? There's a difference between an announcement, and you got to think back in that day. It's not like now, right?
That's almost 100 years later.
Yeah. It's not like, okay, I can just make a phone call. Like, but there were, from my understanding, that there were instances of that sort of thing that still prevailed, right? I mean, even now, if you think about it, when people say, oh, I went to a certain part of the country and they're so old fashioned. Mm-hmm. They're so backwater. And people say that now. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine in 1940 or 41 or 42 or 45, how much a place could still be steeped in old tradition and old culture. And now the only caveat to this, though, is I'm not 100% sure that during his time that it was only Caucasians that own these places. So really when I'm explaining sharecropping, that's like the immediate aftermath, right? But even further than that, it could still be that sort of arrangement. And I would have to find out from him if the owner of that land was indeed white. Because I don't know, because after a certain time, I mean, black folks did own parcels of land and have, homes and that sort of thing.
And they just kind of continued that.
And it could have just been something where they just continued that practice, right? You can come work for me, right? Because this is, probably well before unions and actual like, oh, we have, a number of laborers for us or farmers or what have you. So I'd have to ask him about the specifics, but I know that he used that term specifically.
Okay. So I want to ask you this question and then we'll get to the topic.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on Juneteenth and why you don't celebrate it? Your perspective, not necessarily representing the community.
Yeah. No, yeah, there's going to be a lot of how I personally feel and then how other folks in the community feel. I am very, I guess, particular about celebrations in general because I want to understand where they came from and what they're about. Oh, okay. So given that Juneteenth is about the Emancipation Proclamation, was it really an Emancipation Proclamation? To me personally, absolutely not. Got it. Right.
Your family is testament to that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, if you do any sort of digging into any sort of history book that is going to be open and honest with you, I mean, even and I know this will be a conversation probably for another episode of our We're Not So Different. But as much as in American tradition they talk about, the great thing, the great forefathers and who built the country, yada yada yada. If you really get into the skinny of why that announcement was made, it wasn't made out of the kindness and gratitude of the colonizer at that point in time, right? It was a war move. It was a war tactic. It was a strategy. If you read anything related to Abraham Lincoln, he didn't care whatsoever whether or not black folks or former Africans rather were slaves or not. It was irrelevant to him. Mm-hmm. It was about saving and preserving the Union solely. Mm-hmm. Nothing to do with, oh, I actually believe that these stolen Africans are real people with real thoughts and can be, contributors to our society, et cetera, et cetera. It was simply about the Union. And there were a lot of conversations that happened after that about, well, what do we do with these folks? Once we've done that, there were conversations centering around, do we ship them to Cuba? Do we ship them to Haiti? Do we ship them? There was one conversation about, do we ship them back to Africa?
So basically, we're done with them and just
we're done with them. So how do we get rid of them? But it was too expensive to send them to Africa. One of his, I believe, if my memory serves correctly, one of his advisors said, the idea of sending them back to Africa is not a bad idea, but it would be too costly for us to do so. So it's to me, celebrating the day when someone made a call to free you, not because of who you are, but simply because of what advantage it would provide them. Wow. I don't necessarily know that I want to go out and celebrate that day. It was happenstance, to be honest.
Right.
So,
wow. Okay.
For another day.
Yeah.
For another day, I'll have to dig into my textbooks and.
I'd like to invite someone to come speak who's for it.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
And just have you guys have that conversation.
We could probably find someone at the.
Oh, I have someone in mind.
Yeah.
So the conversation we wanted to have today was around the N-word.
Yeah.
And the way it came up was Ali met my sons for the first time today.
Awesome kids.
Thank you.
Good looking kids too.
Thank you. Like their mama.
Pleasantly surprised.
Rude. Their dad was like. And your son is very handsome, quite the gentleman.
Thank you very much.
Glad to have him. As we were, preparing for this podcast, I confessed to Ali, which I do a lot, about how my children sometimes, more frequently, recently, as they're getting older, and they've been using the N-word, and how that has been kind of playing in my internal dialogue when I say something. And then it just really, 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 really got me present to, one, the impact it has on a human being, being called that, especially when it's in terms of the color of their skin, right?
Yeah.
So I don't like the word being used, but you were more surprised that. Go ahead, tell them what surprised you most.
Funny, because I've been told that I have a very expressive look, and my facial expressions are very unique, and my son picks it up too. So it's so funny to watch him get excited or angry or upset, and his teachers tell me the same thing, his expression. So my expression surely was that of shock and awe and surprise. I was completely blown away by it, but which is great though, because the point of this podcast is to talk about culture. Like this whole thing came up from culture outside of just diversity and inclusion. There's a diversity side, there's the inclusion side. So the diversity is saying, I'm Black, you are Ryan, right? There's a diversity, but the inclusion part of it is let's talk about these things.
Yeah. So
that threw me, but why it threw me is because of how I was raised and where my parents are from and their culture.
Sure.
So for my father growing up in the Deep South, obviously down there was said with a hard ER, and it meant something very different, right? That there's the despicable side of the word. When I was growing up, and my father moved to the Bay Area when he was in his early 20s. So that is 44. So late 50s, early 60s. So when I was growing up for him, the classic, Deep South Christian household, using bad language was just not allowed, period, by children. Absolutely not. Like you cursed, I couldn't say dang or darn. Like that was too close to damn especially as far as my mother was concerned.
So we got away with that growing up because my parents are immigrants. And even though I identify as Muslim, I was not raised in a religious household at all. And I think half the time my mom didn't understand what we were saying anyways. Right. I think it was, we were speaking too quickly. It's kind of like one of those things where, you listen to songs that you grew up with and you used to sing.
Right.
Like, and then when now as an adult you actually listen to the lyrics and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I used to say that.
Oh, that's what he's doing to her? Oh.
Salt and pepper, what?
Right.
What are we pushing? No.
Right.
Right? So I think we got away with a lot.
Yeah.
That I don't think most in a traditional household, like if I was in Iran, and of course every family is different, but I think, we're just raised with that certain respect. Like there are certain things you just knew not to say to adults, or certain language, like in Farsi, when we're speaking to an adult, just like with French, or I believe Spanish, and other languages, we have a formal version of the word. Yeah. Right. Okay, if I want to say you, my son, if I'm talking to you, I'll say to. But if you were like my boss or someone I respected, I would say shoma.
Oh, okay.
Not that you don't respect.
Yeah. I'm definitely a two.
So for us, I think because it's in our language, our parents didn't have to tell us over and over to be respectful. Right. It's in our language. It's built in the language. Right. So we knew when I was saying, that I was speaking differently to different people. Like I knew there were certain people that I couldn't speak with.
So similarly here, like sir, ma'am, Mrs. That's the formal. So back to like the cultural aspect of this is, so when I was growing up, my father didn't use a lot of profanity at all. And and for him, it was more of a respect thing and use your words, right?
Okay. So he led by example.
My father absolutely led by example. And so it was funny when you were saying that, your kids use the N-word, and I was like completely shocked. My father used it. When I was growing up, if my father said the N-word, it was in reference to someone that he thought was the salt of the earth, right? That he thought was selling drugs, or he would use it for people that sold drugs, who were standing on the corner completely wasting their time and their whatever opportunity they may or may not have had to do something that was not going to work long term for them from a success factor or from an education factor or whatever. He specifically referred to black kids who weren't about anything as that. So I knew when I was growing up that for him, when he said it, that wasn't good. When my friends said it, it was a term of endearment, right? So and the funny thing about language, just to take like a very slight detour, it means whatever the person wants it to mean. And what I mean by that is, I know women, right, that call each other bitch all the time. Right. And love each other. Sure. Bitch. Right? Like all the time, right? So exactly. So I kind of grew up in that split where I had an old father from the South, but I grew up in the Bay Area, very far from the South, in a very diverse area in the Bay, in a diverse area within the Bay Area. So on the street I grew up on, it was all blacks and Latinos. Okay. It was like one white guy. that was our age when I talk about the folks that were our age. So it was interesting growing up with that dichotomy in the household. When he said it, it was just like, oh, I don't want to be that N-word. But then outside of my friends, like, I'm that N-word.
Yeah. So for me, like, I think growing up, my parents are very casual. I do swear around my dad, particularly, more comfortably than I would my mom. And my reasoning around allowing my kids to say it, even though they know I don't like it, and my thoughts about it, and me not being a black person or of the African American community, like I don't really feel like I get to say one way or another whether you know what I mean. Like I don't feel like I have the space, or even though they're my kids, I don't feel like I have the right to really take that choice from them. And when I've talked with people, just like you talk about identifying as black or African American, I know that there is the argument that taking ownership of it, right? So changing the meaning from a negative derogatory to making it more of a companion type thing. And my opinions aside, I didn't want to take that away from my kids. One, I don't feel like I have a place. Their dad uses it, so another reason I can't. Didn't feel like I could take it away from them. But also, as I mentioned, my kids just recently started to engage more with the Black side of the family, or the African American side of the family. And I feel like that's their way of like partially hanging on to that identity. Like this is also who I am. Yeah, I'm Iranian, and yeah, I am my own person, and I don't, being raised in the Bay Area, they have the privilege of saying things like, my color doesn't define me. But
yes, it does. That's another topic. That's a whole other topic.
But like, being raised around that attitude and that dialogue of, I'm not defined by what the color of my skin is. That they have that privilege, right? But I feel like this is just kind of their way of like holding on a little bit.
That's interesting too that you brought that up, because I have to part of We're Not So Different is I have to understand it from your perspective, right? Mm-hmm. I have to use my intellect to try to figure out, okay, if I put myself in the shoes of a person who's not Black, mm-hmm. but has children who
mm-hmm.
are close enough to be recognized as Black by, as I say, by the police.
Oh yeah, they clearly.
Then that's an interesting thing, because I when I was growing up, for my parents, specifically my dad, ownership trumps race, meaning, if this is my house and I don't like something, mm-hmm. I don't care what you are or what you're mixed with or what you identify as. Mm-hmm. My rules are my rules for where I pay bills and where I go and bust my hump at whatever my employment is, mm-hmm. and provide for you. Mm-hmm. And that will trump other things. And I think that probably was built into why my eyes got so mm-hmm. big when you said that they can say that, because for my dad it was definitely like, we're all Black in the household, so that the talk about ownership and that sort of thing kind of goes out the window. And that's where I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm like, I didn't really think about the idea of, well, they're Black and they need their own self-expression. I don't want to tread on their ability to express themselves. But I know my dad would be like, yeah, whatever, I'm paying bills in here if I don't like it. And honestly, to say I don't like something for him is the same as saying don't do it in my house, which is that's interesting. Yeah, so I feel like we need a topic to be to talk about, just talk about what happens when you have children that don't look like you. And you'll be my expert witness on that and the things that you think about as a parent when it comes to not wanting to, in this case, stifle someone's Blackness, so to speak, right? Because that's probably a whole nother thought process. And you're the kids nowadays, I'm sure they're a little bit more, I don't know, I like to call it challenging, if that's even a word. About, well, I'm this and I'm that, and mom let me blah, versus old school style of, I'm still not, my dad didn't directly say it, or my parents, but definitely, speak when spoken to, that generation, speak when spoken to, children are to be seen, not heard.
Yeah. My dad tries to do that, but he's such a joker that it's like, we couldn't take that seriously. Like, Dad, sorry, you can't come and clown me 1 minute and play jokes on me and then be like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I went to write down that note and I lost my train of thought for a second, but I wanted to ask you about, that whole, this is my house, my rules thing. I don't know about other Iranian households, if that was really something that was said. I think it's kind of a little bit known that, we're a little bit more respectful of, our dad is very patriarchal. However, we're also, I feel like when I go into Iranian households, we're also very free and talkative, but I'm just kind of curious, do you think that the fact that your dad had to probably work so much harder to be able to say in my house?
Yeah,
that has anything to do with that need to be this is holding on to, this is mine and this is, you know what I mean? My house, my rules type stuff. I get saying that as a parent, right? As a form of discipline for your kids. Yeah. But, one thing that I've learned from other Iranian parents who mentored me as a single mom, they would say to me things like, let them do whatever they want at home.
Yeah.
That way, when they go out,
yeah. So
they've got their home face, and then they've got their public face.
So, and it's
which is huge in our community.
I'm so glad you said that. I don't even know if that's on this particular topic. We may have to touch on it at another point in time, but let's write a note to touch on that, because I think it's a broader topic, because you mentioned something earlier about color defining someone. We are from a place in this country where color absolutely defined you. So to say that, hey, you can be free at home, sometimes your habits precede you, right? Sometimes your habits are what they are. It's hard to turn that off when you get outside of the home. So if you think about it from a Black American's perspective, especially parents that are from an older generation from the South, you have to train your child in the home. You can't say like, oh, well, when you get in the home, you can do whatever you want, and then hope that they remember that outside in the street, because there's a different consequence. Right? There's a completely different. I mean, I can tell some stories about stuff that happened to my dad, and
so it's also his way of protecting.
literally almost having a pickup truck full of white guys lynch him, 100%. Right, all the way moving to the Bay Area and being, and this will be a story for another day. Being in a police precinct with a police officer, encouraging a man who was convicted of encouraging a quote unquote witness to implicate him in a robbery that he was not a part of when he was just getting off of work.
Oh my God!
Right, so the implications of behaviors is very different. So for me, when I think about what folks are allowed to do, or not to do, the experience defines you, right? It's so inbred in who you are. That's what you think about. So when you say they can say this, I'm like, because for me, when I was home, like, oh, I can't use that language because my father doesn't approve of that. He doesn't like that. And that was probably just a personal preference on his end. I haven't talked to him about that specific word. But that's where it comes from. And I think the old fashioned piece of it is just kind of old fashioned, right? He's just an old fashioned, stern Black man. Like that was his MO. All the kids growing up were scared. Man, we were scared of your dad, Ali. Like that was that guy. So I think part of it is, there might be a little bit of the ownership piece in there, but I think a lot of it was, I worked hard. I'm trying to raise you to be a man, not to be my buddy, not to, it's not about free speech and having fun. It's more about, I need you to make it to this point.
Well, and I think it sounded to me, and I was way wrong, I feel like, on my first question, but like, it sounds to me like he was just trying to protect you. Make sure you were safe. Like, make sure you became the man that he wanted you to be, and survive what was happening outside. And all of the views and things that he unfortunately had to endure. There's definitely a lot of it that is definitely survival, because I think tied into that is when you develop, I think nowadays people call it swagger, when you develop that swagger at home of being overconfident and this, you take it outside where you can't help it. And especially as a child, right? A child and young adult. And it's like, you can't do that, right? Like, not being Black, you can't do that. Not in this country, you can't do that. Even now, like, how many different stories do we need to pull up about somebody getting, just saw
the woman just got, she was in her own home asleep and got shot through the window, right? Like, so the times aren't that different. I mean, the year might have changed, but the implications,
we're shooting, right?
Exactly. The implications are still the same. So going back to it is kind of, how you're allowed to use that language. But it's interesting that you say in Iranian households how, because of where you're from and where your parents are from, right? There was nothing necessarily to lose. It was more of we're in our comfort zone culturally and at home, so you can be free. I want you to develop your personality, develop who you are, develop your character, the way in which you speak, but just make sure that you're respectful when you're outside of these doors, right? There was more built in the mind than possibly there, but that's also an important thing, because I think people see folks from that region of the world and sometimes wonder about their level of confidence and their level of, and I call it confidence rather than disregard, because some people see it as disregard for others. When they're confident, when you see folks from the Middle East that are just confident in and of themselves, right, from that part of the world. And that shed a little bit of light on that for me. Not that I have anything against it. I think everybody should be that way. But can you expound more on that? Like, what does that do for the child, right?
I think what it does is it makes you comfortable in your own skin, right? Like, I'm a unique scenario where I was always self-conscious anyways, wherever, because even though I felt comfortable and confident about who I was very proud to be Iranian. I also was very aware of my differences, right? I wasn't blonde. And even though I wasn't being attacked or immediately judged the way I think Black people are, or other minorities are, I'm culturally ambiguous looking. Like, you don't necessarily know.
Right,
especially me. I don't look Iranian. I have light eyes, whatnot, fairish skin. But I think for me, it really, I don't know, it was something I was very proud of. I just grew up not being afraid or ashamed of it. Like, I knew that I had a community behind my back. I had a whole country that was my home outside of the United States. So I think it gives me that different sense of security. And it's interesting because I try to encourage my kids to learn Farsi. And my younger son and I, we were talking about it. He's like, why do I have to learn it? I was like, look, Iranians are everywhere. All over the world. And anywhere you go, there's a community you can turn to. I was like, if you want to move to Japan, I was like, I guarantee you there's an Iranian community in Japan. I was like, I guarantee it. My niece is in Malaysia. Like, we're everywhere. And I said, and we may not be like the most supportive community of each other, and we've got our own little issues going on, but in the long run, we do take care of each other, right? And he was like, yeah, but I'm Black too. And I was like, this difference, I said, between, especially here, and correct me if I'm wrong, I said between a community like the Black community or Latino community is that there's such a big community, right? That it's hard to find your pocket of community that'll be like, I'll help you out. Whereas with the Iranian community, because we're not as big, almost anywhere you go, it's like, oh, we're excited to see, oh, you're Iranian, unless you're in LA, of course. Like, there's just so many of them. They're like, whatever.
Right.
But like, and so anyhow, so I was just trying to like share that. So I just kind of felt that made me feel unique. And that made me like embrace it more than I think other Irani, like my brothers, for example. They're, they've shortened their last names. They've, they've really like assimilated. Right? No right or wrong about it. That's what they chose. For me, I'm like, nope, I'm Safarzadeh. Even my ex-husband, when we got married, his name was Jones, and I was like, nope. Can't do it. Can't be a Jones after I've been Safarzadeh for my whole life. So I think for me, it was really a huge part of my identity and who I was or who I thought I was.
I think that's important though, because I think when we talk about what's come out of this is when we're talking about what we're able to say or not say, right? Just from a simple conversation of, are my kids allowed to say the N-word, right? And my son won't be allowed to, not in front of me. Do I know he's going to say it? Of course, just like he's going to curse, right? Like I curse in front of him, and he knows not to say those certain words, and he knows sometimes he calls me out if I say a specific word. He's like, "Oh, Dad, that's a bad word. You shouldn't say that," right? And I think that might just be where I'm picking up the cultural things that might be Southern culture or Christian culture, right? Because my parents were both raised Christian. So maybe that more so, because I know you see other households of people in the South, right, that may be the same or a different color, where their kids cursing all the time. And it's no big deal. So I think I'm picking up my specific culture dealing with my family lineage, and probably that Christian background of, you don't curse, you don't use foul language. And so, yes, I'm going to impose that on my son. And I know that he's going to use it outside. But it's interesting that out of that comes what the dynamic is. And I think culturally there's clearly a distinction between the two cultures, and that you're definitely pushed to being who you are.
Definitely. Well, I'm trying to think of how to say this because, the title of our podcast is We're Not So Different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of similarities that I've seen in this conversation revolves around, the love of our parents for us, and our cultures and communities where we're from, wanting to make sure we're safe and protected and nurtured. And in that regard, we're the same. Mm-hmm. We're not so different. Where we are different is, I feel like, the driver.
Yes.
Right? Like, I feel like, your community has a lot more, there's a lot more consequence. There's a lot more at stake. There's a lot more to think about. Yeah. And, I've had to have a lot of those conversations with my son as well to talk about, when he started driving, I literally wanted to never let him drive.
Right.
Just out of fear of him getting pulled over and meeting that one bad cop. And it definitely has changed my perspective raising young Black men.
Right.
So I'm just really aware of that difference, and it's something that I think more people should be aware of. Because if we don't know about it and if we aren't aware of it, it won't ever change.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and I think that's a great. I think that's a great close for this. Honestly, our first podcast episode, which is awesome, because from this conversation, it trails off into so many other conversations about background, and that's why I'd love to. I definitely want to have a soon episode on being a parent of a mixed child, and kind of the realizations that come about from having a child that is a different color than you, that has to think about a different thing, and you now have to take on this burden. You now have to partially carry the Black cross a little bit, right? Because you carry the Black. You have to carry the Black cross.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me because it's like I'm happy to partner and be there carrying it with everyone, and then at the same time I'm like trying not to appropriate.
Right.
It's a fine dance between being an ally and just taking over.
Yeah.
So thank you all for listening. Thank you, Ali, for coming. Always enjoy our conversations.
This is always awesome.
Definitely should do this outside of work more so we can actually get more work done.
Yes.
In the office.
And for those listening, thank you so much for listening. We do have an email address. We love your comments. We'd love your thoughts. We'd love your input. We'd also love ideas as well. We have a ton of ideas between the two of us, but we're always open. That email address is wnsdifferent@gmail.com. Again, wnsdifferent@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out.
All right. Thanks for listening to We're Not So Different.